Let's talk about the history and varieties of anti-Mormonism in America. There's been a recent rise in animosity expressed and exercised toward Latter-day Saints in America, especially on the modern right, and discussions of where do Latter-day Saints fit and do they even have a place in society have been raised in the wake of the tragedy at the Michigan shooting at an LDS chapel, the conspiracies surrounding the Charlie Kirk death at Utah Valley University, and a resurgent evangelical anti-Mormonism, especially in digital spaces that classify Latter-day Saints as cults. Now, these developments may dispirit a lot of Latter-day Saints, and justifiably so, but they're far from new. In this video, I'd like to do a few things. First, I'd like to trace a general historical overview of anti-Mormonism in America and provide 4 primary categories through which we can understand these expressions of animosity toward the Latter-day Saints. Then I want to talk about why some of that opposition dissipated during the 20th century while others grew louder. Then I want to highlight some of these varieties of anti-Mormonism and how they are expressed today, especially during and after Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. And then finally, I want to emphasize the nature of the most prominent form of anti-Mormonism today, which is a conspiratorial anti-Mormonism surprisingly found from the American right, as expressed from, most recently, Candace Owens, a prominent MAGA right-wing influencer online, and I'm going to do a dissection of one of her very interesting and absurd conspiracies of the Latter-day Saints at the end of the video, so make sure to stay tuned for that. But before I dig in, I do want to talk about the term anti-Mormonism, because it's a term that has a lot of baggage and it's often very problematic. It's typically invoked to just discredit someone who might be sharing negative information or critiques about the LDS Church. That's not how I want to use it here. In fact, I myself, you can just look at the comments on my various videos and see people accusing me of being anti-Mormon or expressing anti-Mormon sentiments. I don't want to use the term anti-Mormon as just synonymous for a critic or analyst or whatnot. When I discuss anti-Mormonism, I'm often referring to people who would actually embrace that label. Those who see the Latter-day Saint tradition as a genuine menace that needs to be either conquered or perhaps eliminated. Though I do admit that the boundaries can often be porous. So if you want to, in your mind, when I talk about anti-Mormonism, you can just insert things like passionate opposition to the LDS Church, if that makes you feel better. But I want to use a term within its historical context. So let's dig in. There has been anti-Mormonism just as long as there has been Mormonism. Ever since the origination of the LDS tradition, there have been those who dedicated themselves and their energies and their ideas toward dispelling and denouncing and exposing the Mormon religion. But not all versions of this anti-Mormonism are the same. So I want to introduce 4 primary categories to understand the historical exercise of anti-Mormonism that should perhaps, I hope, give some context for the varieties of anti-Mormonism today. The first version of anti-Mormonism is evangelical anti-Mormonism or theological anti-Mormonism. And with each of these, I want to highlight a particular person or a book that captures kind of their sentiment, especially from the early periods of the church. Within a year of the Book of Mormon being published and the LDS Church being founded, Alexander Campbell, who is a prominent primitivist religion leader who founded the Disciples of Christ along with Barton Stone, published a series of essays on why the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's revelations were heresies that he then compiled in a book in 1832 titled Delusions. It's a very fascinating read that you can find in its entirety online. That book, Delusions, exemplified one of the most dominant trajectories of anti-Mormonism, which is this evangelical counter-cult movement to try to cast Mormons as heresy, although the heresy label would not come until later because early on, evangelicals see Mormons as not even worthy of the title of heresy. They would call them delusion or fanatics. To be a heresy would mean that you are part of a Christian tradition, but you've embraced some of these wrong ideas. But just in general, this evangelical anti-Mormonism means to express that Latter-day Saints are not truly Christian, that they're not a good religion. And you can think about all those sentiments that are coming from assumptions of what evangelicalism or what Christianity or what religion actually is. The second form of anti-Mormonism is societal anti-Mormonism that's critiquing Mormons as a social group and maybe their ideological acuity. Mormons were seen as corrupt. It's often blended with ridicule. And of course, the most prominent example of this is the Mormon practice of polygamy in the 19th century that shows that these people are so morally rotten that they are practicing something so bad that they cannot be trusted. So this societal anti-Mormonism depicts Mormons as knaves, as fools, as people who do not really live in the modern world. And perhaps one of the most influential tracks that took this take was John C. Bennett, who, remember, was the mayor of Nauvoo and Joseph Smith's right-hand man, who then left the church over a variety of disputes that I'll cover in a future video. And he published his book, History of the Saints, which depicts the Mormons as these morally depraved individuals who are not the leaders being craven and the followers just being depraved. That's a societal anti-Mormonism. Then there's political anti-Mormonism. Political anti-Mormonism comes from those who see the Latter-day Saints as a political movement who conflict with their fundamental views of how society and politics should operate, including notions of federal power and domestic policies. Joseph Smith and Brigham Young being denounced for how they controlled the Mormon vote through block voting in Nauvoo and Utah. And perhaps the person who was most vehement in denouncing this strain of anti-Mormonism was Thomas Sharp, the editor of the Warsaw Signal, the nearby newspaper in Illinois that denounced Mormons as this political movement. Although, of course, it continues on in Utah when Mormons operate the territory of Utah. They originally wanted the territory of Deseret, but they got the territory of Utah, and you have debates over polygamy. And perhaps another important text that exemplifies this political anti-Mormonism was the founding platform of the Republican Party in 1856 that said that they were determined to overrule the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy, seeing Mormons as a political body that does not fit these values. So you can see some overlap with the societal anti-Mormonism, though in political anti-Mormonism is specifically within this political context. And then there's institutional anti-Mormonism, which is believing that the Latter-day Saint Church is so powerful and holds so many levers within society that it is undermining a free democratic nation. This is especially becoming more prominent during the Utah period when Latter-day Saints control the region, they control the banks, they control the hospitals, and perhaps the most popular expose in this vein was Frank Cannon, who was the son of George Q. Cannon, a counselor in the First Presidency, and Frank Cannon published Under the Prophet in Utah, the national menace of a political priestcraft. Again, you can read the whole text online if you want a fun read, where he cast the Mormons as these minions who are shaping all aspects of society, that the LDS Church operates more as a bureaucracy in secret rather than a religion. So those four strains, theological, social, political, and institutional, of course, they have porous boundaries that overlap, but they should at least serve as some foundation for the types of anti-Mormonism that came next. By the way, if you enjoyed this type of nerdy content, these deep dives into the past and what it tells us about the present, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I am thrilled that we were able to pass the 10,000 subscriber mark just a couple weeks ago. I couldn't have dreamed of doing that, let alone so fast. I'm also so grateful for those of you who have become members of the channel. Your financial donation and gift is what enables me and my wonderful producer, Anthony, to put in time in putting this together. We try to put out 3 videos a week on deep dives on historical topics on Monday, connecting the past to the present on Wednesdays, and then a pulling back the curtains and talking about the work behind historical analysis on Fridays. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. You can also subscribe to my Kit newsletter, which gathers not just my YouTube videos, but all the videos I do across social platforms on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. It compiles my essays and my interviews, as well as alerts you to upcoming events or things of note. All right, let's get back to the topic of the day. Now, during the 20th century, especially in America, and I want to emphasize, I'm framing this story as an American story because I'm an American historian, anti-Mormonism in the global sphere takes on a very different hue that's quite fascinating. I may do a video on it in the future. But during the 20th century in America, those general trends, those through lines of the 4 different types of anti-Mormonism hold, although with important nuances. Now, the evangelical and societal opposition remained, though they mostly subside. They were not as strong. Mormons were seen as not as much of a threat anymore to evangelicals, in part because they gave up polygamy and they were trying to assimilate into American culture. Further, evangelical fundamentalists were not as concerned with denouncing the Mormon heresies, though there certainly were some who are still trying to do that. But they were more focused on internal renewal. And the rise of evangelical fundamentalism in the early 20th century is an important story in its own right, but it's notable that it did not cast Mormons as their primary opponents like they had in the 19th century. And further, Americans started priding themselves on inclusion, and Mormons were an example of this. They could say that our ability to incorporate Mormons, assimilate them into our society, is an example of how tolerant we are. This is an era, especially after post-World War II, of what scholars call tri-faith America, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, where we are going to embrace all these different religions that used to be rivals because the modern age is much more tolerant. And Mormons were able to fit this picture, especially this pioneer image of colonizing the West. And they were able to lean on their whiteness and colonization and capitalism in particular to show that they belong. So by the 1960s, when George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, is governor of Michigan and then running for the presidency, his Mormonism is seen as an asset, that it wasn't seen as something that was bad like it would have decades before and indeed decades later. Now, those are 2 forms, right? The evangelical and the societal. The political opposition almost entirely disappears, mostly because the Latter-day Saints give up their own political party, the People's Party. They embrace the 2-party system, and they're successfully courting both parties at least through the first half of the 20th century. Utah was a swing state, as hard as that might be to assume now, which means that these political parties could not afford to alienate or offend the Latter-day Saints, and so Latter-day Saints were incorporated within the political system. And while there were some prominent LDS individuals, J. Reuben Clark, Ezra Taft Benson, Cleon Skousen, who are most certainly partisans and only saw one party, the Republicans, as right for the Latter-day Saints, the institution itself, the LDS Church, successfully posited itself as non-partisan, which allowed them to avoid a lot of the accusations as before. But while political anti-Mormonism mostly subsided, and evangelical and societal anti-Mormonism was just not as prominent as before, what remained was the institutional anti-Mormonism, especially as Latter-day Saints become so powerful and dominant in American views of the Mountain West. They controlled many hospitals, banks, large corporations. The Mormons were depicted as a nefarious influence on the broader society. One of my favorite images that kind of captured this is this anti-Mormon cartoon, which shows the Mormon octopus with the tentacles of the church touching all aspects of society, which is seen as dangerous and un-American. What I think is significant here is how Americans are tapping into a larger anti-institutional conspiratorial rhetoric. Compare that Mormon octopus cartoon with this one of the papal octopus, accusing the Catholics of doing the same thing. Or maybe this octopus, a Standard Oil octopus, showing that the large corporation of Standard Oil Company was also influenced society. In other words, many Americans who were terrified of these large corporations controlling every aspect around American life were easily placed onto the Latter-day Saints. And this was, in many ways, the dominant strain of anti-Mormonism through the early 20th century. Now, the next major shift comes with the rise of the religious right in the 1970s and 1980s, where Latter-day Saints are included in this new political coalition that allows them to work with the same evangelicals who used to denounce them. But I do want to emphasize that alliance was far from determined. In fact, during the 1960s and the 1970s, there were the origins of a resurgent evangelical anti-Mormonism, driven by this impulse within the evangelical and fundamentalist community to purge America's Christian body of those groups that didn't belong. Most prominent was Walter Martin's best-selling book, Kingdom of the Cults, which denounced Mormons, among other groups, as being un-American, un-Christian, and not fit for main society. There is also fear of Mormon growth in evangelical strongholds, especially in the South, where the Latter-day Saints announced that they're building temples in Atlanta and Dallas, making inroads in the Bible Belt, and evangelicals therefore fearing that the Mormons were encroaching on their territory. But in the midst of that, with the Religious Right Coalition, with leaders like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, envisioning an alliance of groups that previously hated each other to oppose progressivism, Latter-day Saints proved useful, especially in their opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment, and eventually with their opposition to the same-sex marriage group. And I think one important moment that kind of captured this alliance, this choice by evangelicals to adopt the Mormons as political allies and push off the theological evangelicalism, was when Ed Decker, who made the anti-Mormon movie The God Makers, which was shown before tens of thousands of evangelicals at showings throughout the United States, Pat Robertson, one of the leaders of the religious right, who led the Christian Broadcasting Network, chose not to show that movie, The God Makers, because he didn't want to offend the Mormons, because he wanted to work with them in the political sphere. And I do want to give a shout out to a recent Baylor PhD student, Ahmadi Ametsa, who wrote a brilliant dissertation on this topic, and I hope it finds a home soon to be among publishers, so all of you can read it. So this created a tentative alliance between one large segment of people who had hated Mormons, the evangelicals, and these Latter-day Saints. But that utilitarian alliance was in no ways permanent. And while it has worked quite well over the last few decades in consolidating that conservative power, it's far from impenetrable. And in fact, we've been seeing some cracks in that foundation. So let's talk about how that alliance evolved and the broader trajectories of anti-Mormonism developed during Mitt Romney's presidential runs, because that was the next time that there's a big national discussion over whether Mormons belong, whether they're considered Christian, whether they can fit into American society. Remember, this is the time of the Mormon moment. And the evangelical opposition was clear when Mitt Romney first wanted to run for the presidency for the 2008 election. There's this telling anecdote in McKay Coppins' book on Mitt Romney, in which Romney sat down with several prominent evangelical leaders, and he planned to strategize them about politics. And instead, they all wanted to know, what is your definition of Christ? How do you know whether you're saved? Showing that they were not comfortable with working with the Mormon. And apparently the meeting did not go well. In fact, while Romney was running for that first campaign, there are many evangelicals who spoke out against him, showing this anti-Mormonism that was always bubbling below the surface. The Reverend Bill Keller said a vote for Mitt Romney would be like a vote for Satan. Mike Huckabee, one of Mitt Romney's opponents in the race, said, "Don't Mormons believe that Jesus and Satan are brothers?" which is shorthand for this different cosmology that evangelicals often pilfered the Mormons for, forcing Mitt Romney to eventually speak on the topic in December of 2007, giving his own JFK-like address of saying that religion is not going to shape how I do the presidency. Again, I may do a video on that address because I think it's quite interesting. Now, Romney does not get the nomination for 2008, of course, but he does get in 2012. So we get this begrudging concession among some of these evangelicals that, okay, we'll support him. Robert Jeffress, who is a Baptist pastor in Dallas, put it most, I think, succinctly when he said, well, Mormons may be a theological cult, but they're not a sociological cult, so we're willing to work with them. And in fact, it was during Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign when Billy Graham's website removed Mormons from their list of cults who can't be trusted. No, so that's how evangelical anti-Mormonism evolved during that time. Political anti-Mormonism is now obviously seen in these new partisan lines. Now that Latter-day Saints are predominantly Republicans, progressives and Democrats are going to denounce the Mormons as embodying those type of political principles. Mormons came to represent conservative politics, especially on gender and race. Although I will note that observers were quite startled during the 2012 campaign, especially when it got to the general election, by the lack of focus on religion by America's left. They worried that it was going to be an onslaught of anti-Mormonism, and it really wasn't, for reasons that maybe I'll dissect at some point in the future. And then there's the social aspect of anti-Mormonism, right? The societal anti-Mormonism that views Mormons as knaves who do not fit within American society. You did see this during Mitt Romney's campaign, including from the American left. You had the editor of Slate, when Mitt Romney was first campaigning, saying that Americans should not vote for someone who believes in the, quote, founding whoppers of Mormonism, showing that they are not smart enough. Or Damon Linker wrote a very famous essay titled The Big Test, which said that Latter-day Saints are not quite ready for that political level because we cannot trust people who pledge allegiance to an LDS church like that is defined as un-American. And you'll see this type of societal anti-Mormonism continue today, especially with America's obsession with ex-Mormon content, which has framed a lot of the public depictions. Again, Ex-Mormonism does not mean anti-Mormonism, but ex-Mormon content can often be used in anti-Mormon narratives. You see this type of ridicule coming out in, say, all those TikTok accounts of people interviewing BYU students, trying to catch them and show, how funny and backward they are. Or even recently at football games, the BYU, where you have crowds chanting at Colorado State University, University of Arizona, and more recently at Texas Tech in Lubbock, F the Mormons, or chanting derogatory things about the Latter-day Saints, that there's some social capital gained in making fun of the Latter-day Saints, or at the very least that the Latter-day Saints are lacking the capital that allows them not to be ridiculed in that type of sense, which is born out of the societal anti-Mormonism. But it's the other framework of anti-Mormonism, the anti-institutional opposition, that has recently taken center stage, and I want to talk about that a little more. We live in an era of rampant conspiracies, and there are a number of reasons for this. The proliferation of information and misinformation online, the growing distrust of institutions, and the partisanship of modern politics all lead people to believe in types of conspiracies, especially those conspiracies that talk about dangerous and nefarious large institutions. And the global and powerful bureaucracy that the LDS Church has become has made it well fit for these types of conspiracies to slide into that position as an enemy. And Mormons do get this type of conspiratorial branding, or where they're the targets of these conspiracies, from all ideological sides, right? Progressives see Latter-day Saints as shaping conservative politics, building a massive financial system and restricting rights. Now, not all of that is conspiratorial. Like most conspiracies, there's some root in the church, or root in the truth. But then you spin that further toward, these backroom deals that are shaping society or breaking the laws or whatnot. And then conservatives, of course, will see this massive global conglomerate hiding real harm and restraining the necessary reform, representing the type of establishment that is in power and is holding society back. And evangelicals, who are adapting this anti-institutional conspiracy and anti-Mormonism, are drawing from this longer history of anti-Mormonism to connect the faith to demonic influences, which is where we're seeing this evangelical anti-Mormonism morph in a conspiratorial anti-institutional anti-Mormonism. Perhaps most notably Mark Driscoll, an evangelical pastor online, famous for his murky past and some of his issues, who in the wake of Charlie Kirk shooting at Utah Valley University said that the killer was possessed of a demonic spirit and that the Latter-day Saints aren't Christians and this is just the fruits of their heresies. Also prominently, we see Tim Ballard, the former poster boy for the Latter-day Saint tradition, turning against the church once he's exposed for many sexual assault allegations, was excommunicated. I did a whole video on Tim Ballard a few weeks ago. Go back to watch that if you haven't yet, if you want the broader context of where he came from and what he's doing now, although I will note some updates in recent weeks where Tim Ballard has finally come out and admitted that he was excommunicated, though now blaming what he calls the deep church, right? Directly borrowing deep state language and denouncing this corruption within the LDS institution. Surprisingly, although it shouldn't be a surprise if you know his background, the LDS Church easily slides into his conspiratorial framework, in which he used to defend the church or promote the church through his hypothesis series. Now the church is the enemy. So you see how easily these players fit around in these conspiratorial backgrounds. Which takes us to Candace Owens, a very prominent MAGA right-wing thinker online with a huge following, used to have a close connection to Donald Trump and other figures, although now she's increasingly marginalized, though still with a lot of influence. She was also a close friend of Charlie Kirk, and claims that Kirk visited her in a dream to tell her that he was killed through betrayal. And she has directly called out several of the people who work with Charlie Kirk, including Tyler Boyer, who was a Mormon, her denouncing that there was kind of this deep state influence within Talking Points USA, driven by this Mormon cabal. So now, I want to dissect one recent example from Candace Owens, from one of her videos in the last month, in which she talks about this grand conspiracy and where the Mormons fit in. This is similar to how I broke down the Tim Ballard video recently. So for background to this, she's talking about how she, before the Charlie Kirk killing, she had picked up on some chatter on the dark corners of the internet, and she needed to know what it was.
And strangely, I'm not kidding, and I'm going to show you these messages, I came across what looked to me like a bunch of people talking about bees. You're going, Candace, what do you, like literally bees, in a way that the only way I can describe it to you is like they were speaking about bees, but they weren't speaking about bees. It was very coded.
Okay, so what were the strange buzzing of the bees?
Then came September 10th. Obviously, Charlie lost his life. And a few days later, I was told, and I sensed instantly that there was like a hive of people that were involved in this. I just knew it. And when it happened, I just went, oh my goodness. And my gut is telling me that this was the thing, that the dread that I sensed that was coming out of school. And I had no idea. I am not a flag person at all. And then someone told me, and I was astonished that Utah recently, extraordinarily, did modernize their bee flag. I had no idea that the Utah state flag is a hexagonal beehive, right?
But Candace, why does Utah have a flag with a beehive on it?
And notice to me that it has always been the beehive state. So in 2024, they modernized their flag, but they've always been known as the beehive state. And to be clear, it's not because they make honey. It's not because they have a high presence of bees. In fact, in terms of making honey or bee-related products, they rank number 24.
So if it's not because they have lots of literal beehives and produce honey, why is it?
It's actually the beehive state. It relates to the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints. Early Mormon pioneers founded that state, and they liked the idea of a beehive working toward a common good. Now, if that sounds vaguely familiar or communist to you, the idea of worker bees, yes, that's where it's from. So
let's just take a moment and note that accusing the Latter-day Saints of being secret Soviet agents is about the worst nightmare for Ezra Taft Benson. But Owens then goes on to explain how she knows that this Soviet sleeper cell network is embedded within the LDS Church and how it was behind Charlie Kirk's tragedy.
So what's happening here? Well, I can tell you my suspicion. I think that this is a program. I do. I don't know, but I know. I don't know, but I know.
Well, I, for one, am convinced. She definitely knows that she knows, even if she doesn't know how she knows. Anyways, I do find it ironic that the way she frames that knowledge is very similar to a Latter-day Saint testimony, right? That I know X and X is true because, with every fiber of my being and whatnot. Now, she's continued to focus on Mormons in the ensuing weeks, accusing them of money laundering, drawing on evangelical anti-Mormonism, of calling them heresy, saying that there is something evil within that cabal. And what's so notable about this rising anti-Mormonism in the discourse of Candace Owens and others is how they are picking up these tropes from the past, these long trajectories of anti-Mormonism that still sadly shape much of American culture. So there you have it. That's a general overview of how anti-Mormonism has operated in American culture. 4 primary categories into which you can categorize these different versions of anti-LDS animosity. There have long been these different strains, although they have ebbed and flowed. And much of this current moment, this contemporary discourse, is a culmination of these already present trajectories. I think it's interesting to watch from here on out if we see a return to evangelical anti-Mormonism on the American right, now that these white Christian nationalists are in power and may not see Mormons as necessary collaborators like they had in their past. If they do, they'll have a wealth of background and history and materials that they can resurrect once again to attack their theological enemies. I hope this video made sense. If you have different categories or you want to quibble with the categorization, please leave comments. If you think of any other prominent examples that that deserve attention, please leave those in the comments as well. Like the video if you found it useful, share it so we can get a broader discussion, and if you want more nerdy content, you can subscribe to the channel and consider being a member if you want to give back. History has never been more relevant than it is right now because it gives us context in a moment that sometimes it can feel unprecedented. But those precedented stories are what give us meaning.